Hello, everybody. Today is day 223 and reading from Jeremiah chapter 14 through the 17th verse. The question I begin today in our reading with you is, are you a shrub or are you a tree? And you'll understand that, obviously, if you've read this passage, but also as I get to the end of the sharing. God gives some really hard words for his people. Now, it seems to be intensifying. He's ticked, he's angry. In fact, he says, I'm tired of relenting. He guarantees serious ramifications for the sins of the people. In fact, he lays claim that he himself will send drought, devastation, and disaster. It's a difficult thing that when tragedy occurs and we quickly affirm and say to people, well, God won't do that, when in reality we are certainly reading much in the Old Testament writings of God's direct involvement with catastrophes and with disaster. And when they ask, why has God done this? Why has he allowed or sent this our way? And he answers very specifically, and he gives them four things. First of all, he says, because of idols. You serve, you worship, and you bow down to these idols. Then he says, secondly, because you've forsaken me. You've not only forsaken me, you have ignored and broken my laws. Then he said, thirdly, each one of you follows the dictates of your own heart, as if to say you make up your own rules. In fact, that phrase, dictates of the heart, is repeated many times in the writings of Jeremiah. And finally, he says, God says, you refuse to listen to me. God is so tired of their repeated cycles of sin that he says, I will not forgive you and I will not change my mind. Now, I want you to think for a moment how that would affect us if God were to come to you and I and say, it's over. There's nothing you can say and nothing you can do that's going to change my mind. He says, in fact, this most stunning and shattering statement in chapter 15, verse 1. He says, listen, even if Moses and Samuel stood before me, my mind would not be favorable towards this people. The man who changed God's mind, Moses, when he stood before God and said, don't destroy this people. And God changed, he relented from the harm they intended to do. And yet God is saying, even if Moses, even if Samuel came and stood before me, my mind, my opinion would not be favorable to this people. But God clearly says no. But I will hand them over to trouble and appoint them over to four forms of destruction. God says in chapter 17, verse 5, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart departs from the Lord. Do you realize that there can be a curse upon you if you indeed deliberately decide that you forsake God and you turn to man and look to man for your hope and your strength? It's so easy for us to look to politicians and leaders and trust that a man can help reverse the troubles and problems that we're facing. And God is saying this will result in a curse in your life when you look to man in the arm of flesh. That person, the Bible tells us, God says, is going to be like a shrub in the desert. You trust in the arm of flesh and rely upon human flesh, you're going to be like a shrub. And you think of a shrub in the desert, you can imagine they're parched, they're dry, they're just there's no life there. But he says, blessed is the person who trusts in the Lord, whose hope is in the Lord. And what does he say? He's going to be like a tree that's planted by the waters. He won't fear when the heat comes. And he says his leaf is going to remain green. And in fact, he'll be unaffected by the drought. He will yield continual fruit. This is similar to what we read in Psalms chapter 1, in which it speaks about being blessed. If you don't, blessed is the man. And he's going to be like a tree planted by the rivers of living water, which bearing forth its fruit in its season, his leaf shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. This series of rebukes and promises by God of sending the people into captivity for their sins and his unwillingness to forgive or to relent of this is followed by an irrevocable promise. Chapter 16, verse 14. Now this is the hope. The fact is that God says, therefore the days are coming when I, the Lord, will bring them back to this land, into the land which I gave to their fathers. The promise of God is that he is going to do what he promised from the beginning in his covenant. Well, this people here are going to pay for their sins, and they will be scattered throughout many nations. But God's promise to Abraham will follow. It may be the next generation or the third generation, but the fact is God is true to his word, and he's bringing his people back to their land. We're living in the day of the fulfillment of this promise, in which God is gathering his people back together in a day when a land of people became a nation. And we're waiting now for the promises of God, and many of them written here in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, Daniel, Revelations. We're living in the day of which we ourselves, this generation, shall not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. You and I ought to look up, rejoice, be glad, because we are not a shrub in the desert, but no, because we trust in God and we believe his word, we live with expectancy and faith, and we're like a tree. Though everything around us is falling to pieces, our roots are spread out. We're drawing our strength from the water, the living waters of God, and we are going to bring forth a great harvest, producing great, tremendous fruit in this final day before the coming of the Lord. The word of God, so powerful, so rich, so applicable, and his word relevant to us today.